Good evening and a very warm welcome to the final lecture of the session, which follows on from our AGM earlier today. Once again, take-up has been most encouraging for this lecture, with 123 fellows, guests and members of the public enrolling, several of them from the other side of the world, particularly from the United States. We are delighted to welcome this evening's speaker, Professor Owen Stanwood, Associate Professor of History at Boston College and a Fellow of our Society. Professor Stanwood's research has focused on early modern European expansion and imperialism, and I first came across his work some years ago when the late Randolph Fine suggested we buy the December 2013 issue of the American Historical Review for the Huguenot Library, since Professor Stanwood's paper, Between Eden and Empire, Huguenot Refugees and the Promise of New Worlds, was the lead article in that journal. In 2011, he published The Empire Reformed, English America in the Age of the Glorious Revolution, and more recently, in 2020, The Global Refuge, Huguenots in an Age of Empire, which informs this evening's lecture. Copies of this work, remarkable for its breadth and scholarship, are available from the Huguenot Museum at huguenotmuseum.org. We will devote a 15-minute slot to questions at the end of the lecture, so please type any question you wish to ask into the chat function on your device. Please address your questions to everyone so that they can be seen by all present. For those who would like to socialize afterwards, we intend to organize chat rooms of up to 30 minutes duration. And as this is the first time we have undertaken this extension, we ask for your indulgence with this organization. A separate link has been sent to you for this. So over to Professor Stanwood for Dreams of Silk and Wine, Huguenot Refugees and the Quest for Empire, and I wish you a very enjoyable evening.
Thank you so much, Barbara. I'd just like to thank everybody at the Huguenot Society, Peter, David, Elizabeth, who I've been dealing with over the last year. I've been, as Barbara said, a fellow of the Society for quite a few years now, and I've used the library and used the collections, and it's a real honor to speak to you today. Of course, I wish that I could be doing this in London in person, but it's slightly made up for by the fact that there's so many people, not just from the UK, but around the world today. And I'm happy to be talking to all of you. And let me just share my screen because I have some images here. Okay. So at some point in the late 17th century, an anonymous writer imagined a different kind of British Empire. The idea appeared in an unsigned and undated memoir, deposited eventually in a set of papers of the Archbishop of London, Henry Compton. The plan's author considered the problem of the Huguenot refugees, the hordes of French Protestant newcomers who had flooded into England over the course of the 1680s. However, for this writer, who may very well have been a Huguenot himself, the arrival of these refugees was less a problem than an opportunity. He proposed using the refugees to settle two linked communities, thousands of miles apart. The first would be in East Anglia, specifically in the seaside town of Little Yarmouth. The town was suffering. It was underpopulated and its economy was in shambles. All it needed was an influx of industrious newcomers, like, for example, a few hundred Huguenots, including artisans, merchants, and mariners. The refugees could jumpstart manufacturing in the region, especially the fishery and the making of hemp and cloth. A depressed community would immediately become a vibrant one. The second part of the plan was even more interesting. In addition to the Huguenot community at Little Yarmouth, there would be another linked colony across the ocean in South Carolina. Like Little Yarmouth, Carolina was desperately in need of settlers if it was to be useful to England, and France's persecuted Protestants were just the people to make the young colony productive. Refugee settlers in Carolina would help their brethren in East Anglia by consuming their manufactured goods, but their main role would be as producers. Carolina was on the same latitude as southern France, perfect for, quote, vignerons and makers of silk. In addition, it would be a good destination for unemployed ministers who could use their talents to convert the local native population. On the whole, the proposal imagined a sort of Huguenot empire in miniature, all under the protection of the English crown. The Huguenots, the author claimed, had the talents and aptitudes to transform the world. Now, at first glance, this bold proposal appears to hold very little significance. The specific plan, after all, never came to pass. It is merely one of dozens of somewhat far-fetched ideas that litter the colonial archives. Nonetheless, this document in particular is worth a second look, as it helps us to better understand the topic of my talk today, the story of Huguenot refugees in the British Empire. This has long been a somewhat puzzling subject. From the 17th century to the present, the few thousand refugees who settled in England's colonies have attracted much attention, maybe more than any other group of refugees, at least by population. Two French historians recently labeled this phenomenon as the paradox of Huguenot America, because while many people have chosen to write about the North American refugees, most have concluded that they were not really that important. Their numbers were small and their economic impact negligible. Their churches and communities faded after the first generation. Huguenots in the British Empire, like the document that I just described, usually seem to be little more than exotic curiosities. To be sure, the Huguenots' descendants have continued to value their history, largely as a passage in the story of American religious liberty, but those without Huguenot surnames have been reluctant to follow suit. Nonetheless, I want to argue that the colonial American Huguenots were important, less for what they did than for what they could have done. The refugees believed they could remake the world, and perhaps more importantly, their British patrons agreed with them. Huguenot refugees could be the key to building a new empire that would propel England to greatness. This empire, had it come to pass, would have had many linked components. Some refugees would settle in places like New England or even Nova Scotia, where they would utilize their expertise to make naval stores that would keep England's shipping industry afloat. Others, as the previous memoir argued, would convert Indians, bringing them into the English Protestant fold. Huguenot merchant networks would move goods around the empire. In short, it was a coordinated global vision of a new empire, anchored by French people, expanding England's influence by producing new stuff. And yet, while it was a diverse vision, much of it came back to the two products specifically mentioned in the proposal, silk and wine. It is these commodities that I want to focus on today, as they provided the impetus for thousands of refugees to travel to America. As almost anyone with a basic knowledge of British imperialism in America knows, the whole colonial endeavor depended on the production of luxury goods. First Virginian tobacco, but later rice, indigo, and sugar. On the other hand, no one associated early America with silk and wine because they never found any success. There were important impediments to producing these crops in North America, and with the benefit of hindsight, it seems clear that they were bound to fail. And yet, that is not how early British administrators saw it. They believed that these two commodities could transform the empire. That could only happen, however, if imperial authorities also found experts who could direct these efforts. In this way, Huguenot refugees became central to imperial planning. The refugees, moreover, were more than happy to join these efforts. A few of them did have relevant expertise with silk and wine, and others simply claimed or implied that they did, taking advantage of British preconceptions about the French. As a result, a few thousand refugees made the trek to America, but these were just the advance guard of what they hoped to be a massive emigration that would remake the empire. Now, of course, that never quite came to pass, but the dream lived on for over a century and helps to demonstrate how religious refugees like the Huguenots became embedded in a world of expanding empires. Now, before we get to the Huguenots, we must first understand what made silk and wine such obsessions to the English. Both, of course, were foreign goods associated with luxury. If wine was a staple in France, it was very much an upper class item in early modern England, where it had to be imported, usually from Bordeaux. As for silk, the fine material made from the cocoons of the little worms that fed on mulberry leaves, it became a key item of consumption for wealthier English women in the early modern period. Much raw silk came from the Middle East and Asia, but it was also produced in Italy, and around the turn of the 16th century, it became a leading commodity in France, produced in Provence and Languedoc, and spun by expert weavers in Lyon. By the 17th century, therefore, English consumers associated both items with France, and they took up an increasing amount of the trade between the two countries. This trade, however, was a problem. The 17th century was the high point of mercantilist thought. European economists and statesmen came to see the world's wealth as finite and politics as a competition for the greater share of that wealth. All of that meant that a negative balance of trade, in which a country bought more goods from other countries than it sold, was a recipe for falling behind in this zero-sum contest for riches and power. Across the century, economic writers decried the English taste for luxury, and silk and wine were frequently the items that they singled out. Why couldn't English consumers stick with wholesome English ale and woolens? Why did they sacrifice the national interest in buying superfluous luxuries from France? Nonetheless, no amount of scolding seemed to be successful in getting rich English consumers to give up their wine and silk. There was, however, another option. If consumers wouldn't stop buying wine and silk, perhaps it could be made at home. In the early 1600s, James I, in imitation of his French counterpart, King Henri IV, attempted to do just that, encouraging the English to plant mulberry trees and even attempting his own silk projects in England. There was only one problem. The climate in England was simply not well suited for silkworms, nor would it easily support the planting of vineyards. As a result, speculation soon moved from England itself to its nascent empire, and especially to the recently formed colony of Virginia. Explorers in the region had noticed large quantities of wild grapes and mulberry trees, and silk and wine quickly appeared on the list of possible cash crops in the new colony. These silk and wine dreams perfectly encapsulated the mercantilist conception of the empire. These new lands, conveniently located on the same line of latitude as southern France, Italy, the Middle East, and China, would produce all of the items that the cold, rainy English climate would not support. Then the realm would profit from these new things and finally vanquish its rivals, like France itself, in the global race for wealth. Yet alas, there was another problem. One could not simply crush a grape and have wine. And the process of turning a silkworm's cocoon into an article of clothing was even more specialized. English people knew nothing of these pursuits. The king and leaders of the Virginia Company thought that by requiring colonists to plant mulberry trees and giving everyone a helpful manual on silk making with illustrations like the one you see before you, they could turn silk and wine into new cash crops. They were quite mistaken. Both wine and silk required expertise, and the English simply did not have it. The Virginia Company understood this and also tried to find foreign experts. In 1620, for instance, 8 Frenchmen from Languedoc arrived in the colony, charged with planting a vineyard and teaching the English to make silk. They abandoned their task within a few years. In later decades, Virginia's leaders looked for other experts, French, Italians, Greeks, Armenians, but they proved hard to find in sufficient numbers to jumpstart the economy. Virginia silk and wine remained an unfulfilled dream, produced in tiny quantities and usually not at all. And yet, the dreams didn't die. In fact, they only accelerated during the Restoration period. The period after Charles II came to the throne in 1660 marked a high point in both English mercantilist thought and the expansion of the empire. From a few outposts in Virginia, New England, and the Caribbean, England's American empire expanded to encompass most of North America's Atlantic coast. These new colonies needed productive settlers who would produce profitable things, and something of a propaganda war soon started, with proprietors of various plantations vying with each other to attract the right settlers. Not surprisingly, silk and wine speculation ran rampant during this period. Nowhere was it more important than in Carolina, a vast new colony just to the south of Virginia. The colony's leading proprietor, Anthony Ashley Cooper, Earl of Shaftesbury, believed that his new colony could realize the dreams of silk and wine that had never quite worked out in Virginia. He went so far as to send his secretary, John Locke, on something of an industrial espionage campaign to France, where he collected information on both wine and silk production in order to apply this knowledge to the new colony. Now, you may have noticed up to this point that I've not mentioned religion at all. Indeed, most of the calls for foreign experts to come to the colonies made no mention of faith. The Languedoc migrants who came to Virginia in 1620 might have been Huguenots, but we'll never know because no one thought to mention it. Other schemes to find foreign settlers targeted Catholics or Orthodox Christians, obviously not much caring about their religious background as long as they had the right talents. In fact, many political economic writers decried religious persecution since it seemed to be bad for business. The contrast between Spain and the Netherlands seemed to confirm the economic advantages of at least limited toleration. And yet, religious persecution was certainly on the rise in the 1670s and 1680s, with France itself as one center of that drama. There is no need here to go into detail on Louis XIV's campaign against the Huguenots, except to say that by the early 1680s, it had resulted in a wave of migration to Protestant Europe, including England, that would only get larger over the course of the decade. Around 150,000 Huguenots fled the kingdom, and while many of their non-French neighbors had enormous sympathy for the newcomers, it represented an obvious logistical challenge. There was rarely enough financial assistance for the refugees, and both lodging and employment could be hard to find. As a result, conditions for Huguenot migrants in places like London or Rotterdam, where the largest numbers gathered, could be quite dismal. Leaders in the refugee community tried to find new retreats, places where French Protestants could have freedom of worship for sure, but more importantly, land and jobs. It was perhaps inevitable that the refugees' dreams of freedom and plenty would collide with imperial planners' dreams of silk and wine. It seemed to be the perfect solution to a number of national problems. By going to the colonies, Huguenots would take pressure off charities in England itself. By producing the right things once they got to the colonies, they would improve England's balance of trade. And to make everything even more perfect, the refugees were French, so they knew how to make those luxury goods that English consumers so desperately wanted. One writer put the matter bluntly, and I quote, "The numbers of refugees here and in other countries near us are objects in this case, both for our charity for them and advantage to ourselves." Now, if much of this impetus for the vision came from English central planners, Huguenots themselves quickly learned to play along. A case in point came in 1679, when two Huguenot gentlemen petitioned the government for land and transportation to Carolina. The men, Jacob Gerard and René Petit, discovered a formula that would work for future generations of refugees. They began the petition by praising England as an evangelical Israel, a place where persecuted people could find religious liberty. At the same time, there were fewer job opportunities, and competition with the native English could cause tensions. The clear solution was to find land in the empire, specifically in Carolina, where the Huguenots could serve the empire by producing useful things. In particular, they were, quote, accustomed to the culture of vines, of grains, of cloth, and in many places the making of silk, the first and last of which were just the things the Carolina proprietors were hoping to make. All of this would help fix England's trade balance, supplying the kingdom with, quote, silks, oils, wines, and such other things which they are forced to purchase of foreign nations. Now, it must be noted that there's no reason to think that Gerard or Petit were especially adept at wine or silk. Both came from Normandy, which was certainly not known for these things, and both had been merchants rather than producers. At least one of them, Jacob Gerard, wasn't even a refugee. He had lived in England for years. Nonetheless, their appeal was quite successful, and internal correspondence from the lords of trade and plantations made clear that their references to silk and wine made the petition far more palatable. The committee declared the plan to be, quote, of very great advantage and importance to the trade of this nation and increase of the king's revenue. just as long as the prospective migrants were skillful and practiced in the manufacture of wines, silks, and oils. Gerard and Petit were most definitely not that, but they received aid anyway, enough to transport 80 Huguenot families to new lives across the ocean. This petition started a pattern. Over the next decade, as the number of refugees increased, more of them sought land and advantages in the colonies, responding to the invitations of proprietors who increasingly began to see these persecuted refugees as the key to future profit. Aside from the petitions themselves, we can see this phenomenon in the numerous French language promotional tracts that appeared in the first half of the 1680s to try and convince refugees to take a chance on America. The first and most complete was by Charles de Rochefort, a Rotterdam minister who had traveled in and written about the West Indies many decades before, and who in 1681 issued a detailed guide to the British North American colonies as an appendix to a new edition of his History of the Caribbean, whose title page you see here. Now, the reasons to go to North America were legion. The air was good, authorities would offer the rights of naturalization, and these were Protestant countries with full toleration. Beyond that, however, Rochefort stressed the economic advantages, that the climate would allow French refugees to pursue particularly French pursuits. Mulberry trees were abundant, which would allow the, quote, innocent little worms that made silk to prosper there. In addition, grapes, quote, grow there naturally without any human labor. In a clear reference to Gerard and Petit, Rochefort noted that 80 families were already in Carolina dedicated to the culture of grains, wines, and olive oils. Now, other promotional tracts contain similar laudatory descriptions of both the colonies on a whole and their potential as silk and wine bastions in particular. One representative tract on Carolina began its section on potential produce in the country by describing, quote, the two sorts of mulberry trees that one finds in the woods almost everywhere, along with wild vines and grapes of all sorts. Not to be outdone by his counterparts in Carolina, the proprietor of Pennsylvania, William Penn, also lauded the possibilities for making wine on the banks of the Schuylkill River, just outside Philadelphia, even noting that he had employed a Huguenot to tend his own vineyard. Penn specifically called for those who knew about the making of wines and cloth to come to the colony, believing that, quote, the French carry out those things better than others. Now, the promotional tracts can be seen as a mirror image of petitions like those by Gerard and Petit. The petitioners sought to convince English authorities that they were worthwhile recipients of aid by bragging of their facility with silk and wine. They were so successful that colonial administrators had to conduct a persuasion campaign of their own, targeting refugees who had now become treasured commodities in their own right. This propaganda campaign was quite successful. If most Huguenots did not make the trek to Carolina or Pennsylvania, word of these places circulated far and wide through refugee networks, providing temptation for those who had long dreamed of Edens beyond the seas and now saw a way to receive land and aid. And the image that you see on your right there is a particularly interesting example of that, a manuscript set of questions and answers about the colony of Carolina. Now, to see how powerful these dreams could be, let us look for a moment at one refugee known only as Durand of Dauphiné. In 1687, Durand published a narrative of his journey into the refuge, which revealed the importance of the New World in the refugee imagination. He first learned about opportunities in Carolina from reading promotional pamphlets on board a ship to London, and he soon made plans with a single woman he met to go to the colony and set up in the silk business. Quote, she understood thoroughly the management of a farm, Durand wrote, and told me that on her own estate she had very successfully raised a quantity of silkworms. Unfortunately, these plans came to naught. The woman died on the way to Carolina, and Durand's ship misfired, ending up in Virginia rather than South Carolina. As he explored the colony, however, Durand came to realize that he had been mistaken. Virginia was clearly better than Carolina, and wine rather than silk was the surest way for Huguenots to prosper in the New World. On a jaunt along the Rappahannock River with an English planter, Durand noted the beauty of the rolling hills and meadows, always covered with wild grapevines. His companion responded that if Durand, quote, could find some way to bring Frenchmen here, he would sell the land to him at a good price. It was not the only offer Durand received. Seemingly every Virginia planter wanted to attract French settlers, and when Durand returned to England, he wrote his own promotional tract, lauding Virginia's prospective wine country as a promised land for Huguenots. It's easy to see that dreams of silk and wine enabled the Huguenot migration towards North America. But the evidence raises a critical question. Were they really serious? With the benefit of hindsight, it seems like these plans never had any chance of succeeding. There are serious environmental problems to overcome. For silk, there was the fact that while America was filled with mulberry trees, they were not the same species that provided food for silkworms. More than that, no silkworms lived in the New World, so they would need to cross the Atlantic, and the poor creatures often died en route. As far as wine went, the American wild grapes did not produce the same wine as their Old World counterparts, and even if they did, there was the question of transport. How could one produce wine that would survive the transatlantic crossing? All of these were serious questions, but amazingly, some Huguenots did dedicate themselves to silk and wine culture. The dreams proved very durable despite failure after failure. In order to see how silk and wine plans fared on the ground, we need to turn to another kind of source, letters written by refugees who made it to America. There are not very many of these valuable sources, but they reveal a lot about what the first months in the New World looked like. Louis Thibault, for instance, was a passenger on the Richmond, the same ship that brought Jacob Gerard and René Petit to South Carolina. Some years later, in 1683, he wrote a detailed letter to friends in Europe describing Carolina and its opportunities, particularly in making wine. Thibault quickly discovered that native grapes did not produce good wine, but luckily he was able to transport Old World grapes that did very well. If he could get, quote, vine stock from Champagne, Sorenne, and Argenteuil, Thibault reported, he could make a good living by selling his wine to American consumers, thus avoiding the nuisance of sending it on transatlantic ships. I hope that with God's help, the vines will in time bring me everything I want, he optimistically concluded. Several of Thibault's neighbors also experimented with wine, and the lack of quick returns did not lead them to give up. The leading merchant Jacques Boyd reported on his efforts in a 1686 letter, noting that Carolina vines were small but surviving, and he hoped to soon market the first American wine. In the 1690s, a Swiss settler, Jean Giniat, noted that efforts continued to progress, both with making wine from wild grapes, which he did not prefer, and planting new vineyards. He believed that varieties from Bordeaux, Spain, Portugal, or Madeira would be best, and he confidently predicted that, quote, we will infallibly make very good wine with the right vine cuttings. Almost a decade later, in 1701, the minister Paul Lescaut reported on the results of these experiments. The imported vines had led to some wine production, but in small quantities. Unlike Giniat, he believed wild grapes were a better possibility and described the wine from them with perhaps not much enthusiasm as assez bon. The colonial correspondence also gives glimpses, while less complete, of early efforts to make silk. The first refugee ship to Carolina, the Richmond, had taken unhatched silkworm eggs to the colony, but they had predictably not survived the journey. Nonetheless, some settlers had dedicated themselves to the industry. An early unsigned letter, probably written by Henri Auguste Chatenier, described some of these efforts in 1687. One settler, Joachim Gaillard, had already turned to silk and, quote, he thinks that it is a sure way and expects to make a very good trade here. Another had planted more than 12,000 mulberry trees. Chatenier was somewhat more guarded than his neighbors. He noted that silk could succeed, but a great investment was required. A decade later, some, but not many, Huguenots had made that investment. A different kind of source, an account book by a goldsmith named Nicolas de Longuemare, allows glimpses at the industry. By the end of the 1690s, Longuemare had become an active merchant in silk in a center of French settlement known as the Orange Quarter. Among the things he traded was not just raw silk, but also silkworm eggs and other implements to practice the trade. Silk had not yet become a cash crop, but neither had the refugees given up. Now, these experiments abounded in South Carolina, the largest center of Huguenot settlement in North America, but appeared elsewhere as well. In Virginia, for instance, refugees finally settled in a new community called Manikin Town in 1700, near where Durand had theorized a wine colony over a decade before. Wine did not figure in any of the promotional materials for the colony, but it did become an ambition after the settlers reached Virginia. A few years later, a Swiss visitor reported trying Manikin Town wine, which he reported to be excellent and very much to their advantage and to the colony. When some of the settlers relocated to North Carolina, they brought their wine ambitions with them. An English visitor, John Lawson, reported that their intent was to propagate vines, and he warmly approved of their plan. After all, he said, wine was a valuable commodity, and with the right experts in some time, quote, we may reasonably hope to see this a wine country. The presence of the refugees was essential, Lawson wrote, since we of the northern climate are neither artists nor curious in propagating that pleasant and profitable vegetable. All in all, therefore, silk and wine did motivate the transportation of thousands of refugees across the ocean and inspired some of them to try and transform the colonial economy to produce these commodities. Nonetheless, most of the time the story ends here, in the early 1700s, as a tale of failure. After all, despite so much optimism, silk and wine did not become cash crops in Carolina, Virginia, or anywhere else in North America, and the Huguenots themselves tended to turn away from these distinctively French pursuits, essentially blending in with their non-French neighbors. Nonetheless, we should not be so quick to end the story, because the dreams of silk and wine did not die. Instead, they reappeared in the 18th century, inspiring a new round of Huguenot colonial schemes. These later plans, so often left out of histories of the refugees, help us understand the long-term importance of the Huguenots in British imperial history, far beyond the time of the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. Now, this final chapter properly began in the 1750s with the chartering of a new organization, the Honorable Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures, and Commerce, eventually known as the Royal Society of Arts, as it's still known today. Though it was eventually royally chartered, the RSA was a private organization that encouraged useful projects of all sorts, pursuits that would move Britain forward, whether at home or in the empire, with a particular attention to improving its balance of trade. In particular, the RSA sought to ensure that the colonies existed to further the national economy, that producers produced the right things. They did this by offering prizes and bounties to people who carried out these endeavors, and not surprisingly, they gravitated to silk and wine. Despite decades of false starts and failures, British leaders still dreamed of producing these things in the colonies for virtually the same reasons as in the 1600s. They needed to vanquish France in the race for the world's wealth. The South Carolina planter Charles Pinckney, speaking of the promise of colonial silk, put it bluntly. In future years, he predicted, your children and mine will live to see all the silk we now import from France imported from these colonies. This new flurry of activity provided the context for the establishment of New Bordeaux, the last major Huguenot colony in North America. It was the brainchild of Jean-Louis Gibert, a Protestant minister from Languedoc, who settled during the 1750s in the western French province of Saintonge. Gibert was one of the leaders of the Église du Désert, or Churches of the Desert, the clandestine Protestant network that started operating in the early 1700s and accelerated its activities in the middle years of the century. The main task for activists like Gibert was to secure toleration for France's Protestants. To this end, Huguenots within the kingdom made frequent arguments for their strategic importance. They pointed out that the previous emigration of Protestants in the 1680s had weakened France by removing so many productive people who took their talents to the kingdom's rivals. This would happen again, they threatened, if the crown did not extend toleration to Protestants. All the Huguenots who stayed the first time would now leave, leading, as one petition said, to the depopulation of the most beautiful provinces of your kingdom, the abandonment of the countryside, and the languor of agriculture. Jean-Louis Gibert was the one who finally resolved to make good on this threat. In 1761, near the end of the 7 Years' War, Gibert traveled to London in an attempt to find advantages for his co-religionists. He managed to gain an audience with Thomas Secker, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and perhaps Britain's most reliable champion for continental Protestants. Gibert told Secker a familiar tale of French authorities who hounded those Protestants who had stayed, threatening them with arrest and death. Many had decided it was finally time to leave. Stunningly, he suggested that 60,000 Protestants were ready to depart France and move to a British territory, under the right conditions, of course. This was a number nearly equal to all the refugees who had fled to Britain and its colonies during the first wave of persecution. Then he added a final touch. The best place for his new colony was America, Gibert noted, because, quote, his people should produce silk. This was an interesting aside. Gibert was a minister, not a silk maker, and his rhetoric up until this point had been overwhelmingly spiritual in nature. But he was an astute man, and he clearly knew both the history of previous Huguenot appeals to the British crown, as well as the current British mania for Mediterranean commodities, like silk and wine. He was not afraid to use this rhetoric when it suited him, and it probably made the difference between approval and rejection of what remained a bold and visionary scheme. No one in the British cabinet at the end of the 7 Years' War wanted to spend a lot of money transporting thousands of refugees across the ocean. But the combination of religious sympathy and desire for a new silk colony got Gibert's plan an audience before George III himself. The king personally pledged to help the Huguenots, and with this most rarefied stamp of approval, Gibert's scheme rose up through the maze of British officialdom, despite clear reservations from a number of important people. The next phase of the plan was to return to France and find his horde of settlers. Gibert first went to his homeland in the Cevennes mountains of Languedoc, perhaps the most Protestant corner of France and a place abounding with silk makers. He claimed that he had been made, quote, viceroy of an island in America, and offered his compatriots numerous advantages to join him, but with little success. Only 2 Seminole families agreed to make the trek, so Gibert returned to the West Coast. Not surprisingly, he had somewhat more success there, finding a number of families from Saintonge and Bordeaux willing to move to his colony. By 1763, according to the French emissary in England, 50 to 80 French families had arrived in England, set to go to America. It was far from 60,000, but still enough to cause consternation among French leaders who didn't want to lose any more useful subjects. After all, they reported that Gibert was not just a minister, but a puller of silk, and that the colony was meant to establish manufactures and mulberry plantations. No wonder that French authorities tried their best to apprehend Gibert, sending out a description of him to authorities around the country, which you can see here. It was too late, though. The minister was safely out of the country, en route to what would become a new Huguenot community in the backcountry of South Carolina. Even if they were smaller in number than forecast, the new Bordeaux migrants still had big dreams once they got to South Carolina. To be sure, many of them made their living in whatever way they could, especially by making tobacco. But Gibert himself did not give up on silk. Indeed, upon arriving in the colony, he spent time on a plantation called Silk Hope, owned by his fellow Huguenot Gabriel Manigault. After doing some experimenting there, the former minister threw himself into his new profession. He produced 35 pounds of raw silk, which he sent off to London to the Royal Society of Arts, hoping to get their help in expanding his efforts, which he claimed would educate the whole province in the said culture. At the same time, he solicited the South Carolina Assembly for assistance, which was eventually successful. The Assembly gave 1,000 pounds to Gibert to establish a public silk filature, essentially a place where people could bring their silkworms to be spun, their silk cocoons rather, to be spun. In addition, he later operated something of a silk school for the public in an old schoolhouse. Members of the public could come and see demonstrations about silk culture with actual silkworms and lessons on the industry. The man who had spent much of his life rebuilding France's Protestant church, had changed professions, becoming an evangelist for silk. Meanwhile, a new arrival in New Bordeaux hatched his own bold plans. Louis de Saint-Pierre was a merchant from Normandy who had left France in the wake of the 7 Years' War, leading a small group of settlers who ended up alongside Gibert's group of refugees at New Bordeaux. Soon after arriving in the colony, Saint-Pierre proposed continuing Gibert's silk experiments, but especially in planting vineyards, thus realizing the long-term dreams of various colonial planners. He was encouraged in this pursuit by South Carolina's Governor William Bull, who had made diversification of the colony's economy one of his main projects. Saint-Pierre sought aid, again from the Royal Society of Arts, as well as from other rich Britons, and his tracts about the promise of American wine are some of the most breathless in the genre. He bragged that wine would transform not just New Bordeaux, but the entire American South, becoming a new cash crop that would ensure a new golden age for the empire. It was only made possible, though, by Huguenots. They are all vignerons to a man, Saint-Pierre wrote about his New Bordeaux neighbors, experienced and trained in this sort of husbandry from their infancy. The claim was not close to true. There were a few vignerons in town, but many, like Saint-Pierre, had no experience with vineyards that we know of. But no matter, English people believed that all French people instinctively knew how to make wine, and Saint-Pierre was happy to indulge that belief when there was money to be made. Like so many of the plans that I've described today, this one also didn't amount to much. It is true the refugees did plant some grapes, and at least one visitor noted drinking good wine there, but Saint-Pierre was not able to attract as much funding in London as he hoped. Perhaps investors were finally leery of supporting a project so much like many that had failed in the past. Soon after Saint-Pierre returned from London, carrying a gold medal from the Royal Society of Arts, but little money, the empire found itself in trouble anyway. Saint-Pierre, like many Huguenots, chose the patriot side in the American Revolution, and may have died fighting the Cherokee in one of the first revolutionary skirmishes in the South. His death marked the end of dreams of silk and wine involving Huguenot refugees. After a century as virtual imperial celebrities, the refugees gradually faded away, becoming curious footnotes in American history. And yet, this story is worth remembering. The Huguenots may not have turned America into a center of silk and wine production, but these dreams lasted well over a century and motivated the creation of dozens of colonial projects. Historians tend, not surprisingly, to focus on phenomena that seem to succeed or lead to something. So the arrival of Massachusetts Puritans mattered, or the arrival of the first African slaves mattered, because these incidents provided the building blocks for what America eventually became. Nonetheless, false starts and failures matter too, because they show us what America could have become. If a set of colonies inhabited by French people growing Mediterranean commodities seems far-fetched to us, it most certainly did not to people at the time. More than that, these failed plans changed the lives of actual people. Thousands of Huguenots did cross the ocean, and they most certainly would not have done so without these dreams of silk and wine. By that measure, we might want to rethink our definitions of success and failure. To illustrate, let me introduce one final character. Pierre Morane was an ordinary Protestant living in the Dordogne region in the 1760s. We have no idea what motivated him to finally leave France, but when he heard about Gibert's new colony, he left home. First to La Rochelle, where he found a ship to Plymouth, and from there to Charleston and eventually to New Bordeaux. He was just one of several hundred colonists, and we would know nothing about him except for two phenomenal sources, a journal and a letter to his father, passed down through his family. These sources give us a rare glimpse of the transatlantic journey from the point of view of an ordinary migrant. Morane's journey was not easy. He endured a storm just outside of Plymouth and had to lodge in some abandoned barracks after arriving in Carolina, living off the charity of the French church. Nonetheless, things got better. In November 1763, he started clearing his own 4 acres of land, planting corn and beans. Though we have not a sufficiency yet, Morane noted, with the aid of God, we will always have enough to keep us from starving until our little harvest comes in. Within a few years, everything had changed. In 1771, Pierre wrote a letter to his father. He had married a woman named Cecile Bale, a fellow refugee, and they had 2 sons. The whole family was in perfect health. As it regards my situation, it is, God be thanked, very agreeable, Pierre concluded. I live in peace with my family and cultivate the earth with success. I have an abundance of that which is necessary for me and mine. The arc of Pierre Morin's story is instantly recognizable. From the refugee's perspective, it is the familiar passage from Babylon to Eden. In the context of American history, it is the quintessential immigrant's tale, what would eventually be described as the American dream. Morin never mentions silk or wine in his letters, nor did he set out to America in quest of some sort of bold economic vision. And yet, if not for silk and wine, Morin would not have gone to South Carolina at all. If Jean-Louis Guibert had not mentioned those magic words to the Archbishop of Canterbury, Pierre would likely have remained in Dordogne. And I believe that, on some level, Guibert and the other Huguenot projectors knew exactly what they were doing. Perhaps some did believe in their economic rhetoric, but more than that, they knew that in order to accomplish their first objective, the preservation of the French Protestant Church, they needed to spin a tale about the Huguenots as economic supermen. At least from the narrow perspective of Pierre Morin, the strategy was a great success. By playing the game of empire, at least some Huguenots were able to find freedom. Thank you very much.